The summer evening hung heavy with humidity, the cicadas' song a constant backdrop to the stillness of the house. The air conditioning hummed quietly, barely cutting through the sticky warmth that clung to the walls. Jake leaned against the kitchen counter, the rim of a sweating beer bottle pressed lightly to his lips as he stole a glance across the room. Ethan stood by the sink, rinsing out his glass with methodical precision, his shirt clinging to his back in damp patches from the day's heat. The curve of his shoulders caught the low light spilling through the blinds, and Jake couldn't stop his gaze from lingering, a flush creeping up the back of his neck that he refused to acknowledge. "Mom and Dad aren't back until late," Ethan said, breaking the silence. His voice was calm, but there was a faint edge to it, something that made Jake's pulse quicken. "They got held up at the lake, I think. Dinner with their friends or something." Jake nodded, his throat dry as he took another sip of his beer. "Right, typical. They're probably halfway through a bottle of wine by now." Ethan chuckled, setting the glass on the counter with a soft clink before turning to face Jake fully. His dark eyes met Jake's, and for a moment the air between them seemed to shift. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make Jake's grip tighten on the bottle in his hand. "Want to watch something?" Ethan asked, his tone casual, though his gaze lingered just a second too long. "I was thinking we could dig through the old DVDs in the den. Maybe something from when we were kids?" "Sure," Jake replied, his voice steady, even as his pulse thrummed with a strange mix of anticipation and unease. "Sounds good." The den was dimly lit, the soft glow from the lamp in the corner casting long shadows on the walls. Jake sat at one end of the couch, legs stretched out in front of him while Ethan flipped through a stack of dusty DVDs. "Found it," Ethan said triumphantly, holding up the case for an old action movie they'd watched dozens of times as kids. He grinned as he slid it into the player, then dropped onto the couch beside Jake, closer than expected, the heat of his body radiating across the narrow space between them. As the opening credits rolled, Jake forced himself to focus on the screen, his grip on the armrest firm. But the closeness was distracting, the way Ethan's knee brushed against his, the faint scent of soap and sweat that clung to him. It was nothing, he told himself. Just two brothers hanging out. Nothing to think about. Nothing to worry over. But then Ethan shifted, leaning back against the couch and letting out a soft sigh. His arm draped across the backrest, his fingers brushing against Jake's shoulder as if by accident. Jake froze. It was a fleeting touch, but it lingered in his mind, setting every nerve alight. He didn't move, didn't speak, his eyes glued to the screen as his thoughts raced. "You're quiet tonight," Ethan said, his voice low, almost teasing. "What's going on?" "Nothing," Jake replied quickly, too quickly. He could feel the weight of Ethan's gaze on him, probing, questioning. "You sure?" Ethan asked, and there it was again, that edge in his tone, subtle but unmistakable. He shifted closer, his knee pressing against Jake's firmly now, no longer just an accidental touch. "You've been acting weird since you got back." Jake swallowed hard, his grip on the armrest tightening. "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but strained. "Just tired, I guess." Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he stayed where he was, his presence an unspoken challenge, an invitation that Jake didn't know how to respond to. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged, until Jake couldn't take it anymore. "I'm going to grab another beer," he said abruptly, standing up and heading for the kitchen without waiting for a reply. The cold metal of the fridge handle was a welcome distraction as Jake yanked the door open, grabbing a bottle from the shelf and twisting off the cap. He took a long pull, letting the cool liquid soothe his parched throat. But the reprieve was short-lived. A moment later, he heard Ethan's footsteps behind him, felt the shift in the air as he stepped into the kitchen. "You always run when you're uncomfortable," Ethan said softly, his voice closer than Jake expected. "You did it when we were kids, too." Jake turned to face him, the bottle still in his hand. "I'm not uncomfortable," he said, his voice firmer now, though he couldn't quite meet Ethan's gaze. Ethan smiled faintly, stepping closer until they were barely a foot apart. "You're a terrible liar, Jake." Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat as Ethan's hand came to rest lightly on his forearm. The touch was gentle, almost innocent, but it sent a jolt through Jake that left him breathless. "Ethan," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, but he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to name the tangle of emotions coursing through him. "It's okay," Ethan said, his tone soothing. His fingers tightened slightly, grounding, steadying. "You don't have to say anything. Just don't run." Jake's chest ached with the weight of unspoken words, the tension between them a living thing, pulsing and undeniable. And as Ethan's gaze held his, dark and unreadable, Jake felt himself leaning into the moment, drawn to a precipice he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Jake's breath hitched as he found himself caught between the magnetic pull of Ethan's gaze and the frantic, pounding rhythm of his thoughts. He felt the tension in the air, thick and unrelenting, as if it had always been there, simmering beneath the surface and waiting for this moment to boil over. Ethan's hand lingered on his forearm, steady and deliberate, his thumb brushing softly against Jake's skin. It was such a small gesture, yet it sent a jolt through Jake's entire body, making his throat tighten and his pulse race. He wanted to say something, anything, to break the spell, but his voice refused to cooperate. "You don't have to overthink this," Ethan murmured, his voice so low it was barely audible over the quiet hum of the fridge. "It's just us here." Jake swallowed hard, his gaze darting to the floor. "Ethan, I don't even know what this is." Ethan took a step closer, and the space between them disappeared, the warmth of his body brushing against Jake's in a way that made Jake's breath catch. "It doesn't have to be anything right now," Ethan said softly. "It just has to be honest." Honest. The word hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Jake let out a shaky exhale, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. There had always been something about Ethan, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, something he'd buried deep and refused to examine. But now it was staring him in the face, impossible to ignore. "I don't think I can do this," Jake said finally, his voice trembling but resolute. He stepped back, breaking the contact between them. I need a minute." Ethan's expression softened, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face, but he didn't press. "Take all the time you need," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I'll be here." Jake nodded, his chest tight as he turned and left the kitchen, the beer bottle still clutched in his hand. He headed for the back porch, the cool night air hitting his face as he stepped outside. The cicadas were louder now, their song relentless in the stillness. Jake leaned against the railing, staring out at the dark expanse of the yard as he tried to make sense of the knot of emotions inside him. What the hell was that? The question looped in his mind, over and over, but there were no answers. He felt like he was spinning, caught in a whirlwind of confusion and something else, something he didn't want to name. He raised the beer to his lips, taking a long sip and letting the bitterness settle on his tongue. He needed to think, needed to clear his head, but every time he tried, his mind snapped back to Ethan, his voice, his touch, the way his eyes had seemed to see straight through him. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Jake stiffened, his heart leaping into his throat. He didn't turn around, but he didn't need to. He knew it was Ethan. "I didn't mean to push," Ethan said quietly, his footsteps soft against the wooden planks as he approached. I don't want to pretend anymore." Jake closed his eyes, the words hitting him like a punch to the gut. He felt Ethan's presence beside him, the warmth of his body cutting through the cool night air, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. "You think this is easy for me?" Jake said finally, his voice rough. He turned to face Ethan, his chest heaving with the weight of his emotions. "You think I don't feel it too? But God, Ethan, it's complicated." Ethan's gaze didn't waver. "Complicated doesn't mean impossible." Jake let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. You make it sound so simple, like there aren't a million reasons why this shouldn't happen. I'm not saying it's simple, Ethan replied, his voice steady but filled with quiet determination. I'm saying it's real, and I think you know that. Jake stared at him, his throat tight with unspoken words. He wanted to argue, to push back, but he couldn't, because Ethan was right. There was no denying the pull between them, the way it had always been there, simmering beneath the surface and waiting for this moment to explode into clarity. I don't know how to do this, Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what it means. Ethan stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they were barely inches apart. It doesn't have to mean anything tonight, he said softly. It just has to be honest. Honest. That word again, carving through Jake's defenses and leaving him raw and exposed. He felt Ethan's hand brush against his, tentative and light, as if giving him the choice to pull away. But Jake didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a shaky breath, his gaze meeting Ethan's as something inside him finally gave way. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's wrist before sliding upward, closing around his forearm. The tension between them crackled like a live wire, and Jake felt his chest tighten as Ethan leaned in, his movements slow and deliberate. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, uneven gasps as Ethan's face hovered just inches from his own. And then Ethan kissed him. It was soft at first, tentative, a question asked in the language of touch. Jake froze, his mind spinning, but then something shifted. The world fell away, and all he could feel was Ethan, his warmth, his steadiness, the quiet desperation in the way his lips moved against Jake's. Jake kissed him back. It was instinctive, a surrender to the moment, and it felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. He reached up, his hand sliding into Ethan's hair, and pulled him closer, the kiss deepening as the tension between them exploded into something wild and uncontainable. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathless, Jake stared at Ethan, his chest heaving. He didn't have words for what had just happened, for the way it had made him feel like he was both falling apart and coming together all at once. Ethan reached up, his hand brushing against Jake's cheek in a gesture so tender it made Jake's throat tighten. We'll figure it out, Ethan said softly, his voice steady and sure. Together. Jake nodded, his chest aching with a mix of fear and longing. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with Ethan's touch still lingering on his skin, he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back. The rest of the night passed in a blur, the weight of what had just happened pressing heavily on Jake's chest. Ethan hadn't lingered on the porch. He'd stepped away, giving Jake space, leaving with a murmured, "I'll see you inside." That was both reassuring and maddeningly loaded with implication. Jake stood there for what felt like hours, the cool night air doing little to soothe the fire that still burned beneath his skin. When he finally went inside, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the living room lamp. Ethan was nowhere in sight, and Jake climbed the stairs in silence, each step heavy with the memory of Ethan's lips, his touch, his words. He shut the door to his room behind him, leaning against it as he let out a long, shuddering breath. The stillness was suffocating. He paced the room, his mind replaying the kiss over and over, each detail vivid and inescapable. He could still feel the press of Ethan's hand against his, the way his fingers had tightened, grounding him in a moment that felt like it might swallow him whole. And the kiss. God, the kiss. It wasn't just the way it had felt, though that alone had been enough to send his thoughts spiraling. It was what it meant, the line they had crossed. Jake sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a precipice, staring into an abyss he didn't know how to navigate. He wanted to tell himself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would pass, but deep down he knew it was more than that. It had been building for months, years even, an undercurrent he'd ignored, dismissed, buried, and now there was no ignoring it. No pretending it wasn't real. A soft knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. His heart leapt into his throat as he stood, his pulse quickening. He knew who it was before he even opened the door. Ethan stood in the hallway, his face half-lit by the dim glow of the nightlight plugged into the wall. His expression was unreadable, his dark eyes steady as they met Jake's. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with everything they weren't saying. "Can I come in?" Ethan asked finally, his voice low. Jake hesitated, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. Part of him wanted to say no, to shut the door and shut out the storm that was brewing between them. But another part of him, the part that had kissed Ethan back, that hadn't pulled away, couldn't bring himself to do it. He stepped aside and Ethan slipped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air heavy with unspoken tension. Jake sat back down on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as Ethan stood a few feet away, his gaze unwavering. "I didn't mean to make things harder for you," Ethan said after a moment, his voice quiet but steady. "I know I should have waited. Let you figure things out first." Jake shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping him. "Figure things out? Ethan, I don't even know where to start. This—" He gestured vaguely between them, his words faltering. I don't even know what this is." Ethan stepped closer, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he didn't want to startle Jake. "It's not as complicated as you're making it," he said softly. "It's just me and you, Jake. That's all it has to be." Jake let out a shaky breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. "It's not that simple." "It can be," Ethan said, sitting down beside him. The mattress dipped slightly under his weight, and Jake felt the heat of his presence, the brush of his arm against Jake's. "You don't have to have all the answers tonight." Jake turned to look at him, his chest tight with a mix of frustration and longing. "And what about tomorrow? Or the next day? What do we do then, Ethan? Pretend like nothing's changed?" Ethan's gaze softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Do you want to pretend?" Jake's throat tightened, his words caught somewhere between his chest and his mouth. He couldn't lie, not to Ethan, not to himself. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't know how to do this." Ethan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Jake's. It wasn't a bold gesture, but it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through Jake's veins. "We don't have to figure it all out tonight," Ethan said, his voice low and reassuring. "We'll take it one step at a time. Together." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of Ethan's words settling over him. He felt Ethan's hand shift, his fingers sliding into Jake's and intertwining them in a way that felt both terrifying and grounding. Jake didn't pull away. "I'm scared," Jake admitted, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. Ethan squeezed his hand gently. "Me too. But I think this is worth it." Jake opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Ethan's. There was no judgment there, no pressure, just quiet understanding. And in that moment, Jake felt something inside him ease. It didn't erase the fear or the uncertainty, but it gave him the courage to take the first step. He leaned forward, his forehead resting against Ethan's, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. The world outside the room faded away, leaving just the two of them in the stillness. And then, with a tentative brush of his lips, Jake kissed him again. It wasn't like the first kiss on the porch, wild and desperate, a collision of emotions. This was softer, slower, a quiet exploration that spoke of all the things they couldn't say aloud. Ethan responded in kind, his hand coming up to cradle Jake's jaw as the kiss deepened. Time seemed to blur, each moment stretching into the next, and Jake felt the tension in his chest ease as he surrendered to the inevitability of it. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing heavily, Jake rested his forehead against Ethan's, his heart pounding. "What now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Ethan smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against Jake's cheek. "Now we figure it out. One step at a time." Jake nodded, the weight in his chest lifting ever so slightly. He didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, with Ethan's hand still on his face and his touch lingering on his lips, he knew one thing for certain. They were in this together. The night deepened, and the house settled into a heavy stillness, broken only by the occasional groan of the wooden floorboards or the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jake and Ethan remained on the edge of the bed, their breaths mingling in the quiet intimacy of the room. Jake's heart hadn't stopped racing, and he could feel every inch of space between them, every point of contact where their bodies brushed. Ethan's thumb grazed Jake's cheek again, a slow, grounding motion that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. "You're overthinking again," Ethan murmured, his voice low and warm. Jake let out a shaky laugh, his hands gripping the edge of the mattress. "Can you blame me? This is a lot." "I know." Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze steady and patient. "But you don't have to figure it all out tonight. We don't have to figure it all out." Jake looked at him, the sincerity in Ethan's eyes like a lifeline. He wanted to believe it could be that simple, that they could carve out this fragile connection without it collapsing under the weight of everything it meant. But his mind churned with doubts, with fears he couldn't quite articulate. "What happens when someone finds out?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The question had been clawing at the edges of his thoughts since the moment Ethan kissed him on the porch. "What do we even say?" Ethan's expression didn't falter. "No one has to know. Not until you're ready. This is ours, Jake, no one else's." The words hit Jake harder than he expected, and he felt a lump rise in his throat. Ours. It was such a simple word, but it carried a weight that made his chest ache. He nodded slowly, the tightness in his throat keeping him from speaking. Instead, he reached out, his fingers brushing against Ethan's in a gesture that felt both tentative and grounding. Ethan smiled softly, his hand turning to meet Jake's, their fingers intertwining. "That's all we need," he said, his voice steady. "Just this." Jake exhaled, a faint sense of relief washing over him. The moment stretched between them, fragile and unspoken, until Ethan's hand shifted, his touch trailing lightly along Jake's arm. The gentleness of it unraveled something deep inside Jake, and before he could stop himself, he leaned forward, his lips capturing Ethan's in another kiss. This one was different, unhurried and exploratory, a quiet surrender to the pull between them. Jake's hand found Ethan's shoulder, his fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as the kiss deepened. Time blurred again, the rest of the world falling away until all that remained was the warmth of Ethan's body, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and the electric connection that thrummed between them. Ethan's hands slid up to cradle Jake's face, his touch firm but careful, as though he were holding something precious. Jake felt the weight of it, the unspoken promise in the way Ethan's thumbs brushed against his jaw, and it made his chest ache in a way he couldn't explain. When they finally pulled apart, Jake's breath came in shallow bursts, his forehead resting against Ethan's. He closed his eyes, his mind a swirl of emotions he wasn't ready to unpack. "Jake," Ethan said softly, his voice a gentle tether pulling Jake back to the present. Jake opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Ethan's. The vulnerability there took his breath away. "What?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ethan hesitated, his fingers brushing against Jake's cheek in a way that made his heart stutter. I need you to know I'm here. For whatever this is, wherever it goes, I'm not going anywhere." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut, and he felt his throat tighten again. He nodded, unable to speak, and Ethan smiled faintly, his thumb brushing against Jake's lip in a gesture so tender it made Jake's chest ache. The silence between them stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was soft, filled with the unspoken understanding that they were in this together, no matter how uncertain the path ahead might be. Ethan shifted, lying back on the bed and tugging Jake gently down beside him. Jake went willingly, his body curling instinctively toward Ethan's. It felt strange and terrifying, but also right in a way he couldn't explain. They lay there in the quiet, their breaths evening out as the tension ebbed away. Ethan's hand found Jake's again, their fingers intertwining once more, and Jake let out a soft sigh, the weight in his chest lifting ever so slightly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jake didn't feel like he was drowning. Instead, he felt something else, a fragile hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could figure this out together. And as sleep began to pull at the edges of his mind, Jake held on to that thought, letting it anchor him in the unknown. The morning arrived slowly, the soft light filtering through the blinds and casting faint lines across the walls. Jake stirred, the haze of sleep still clinging to him as he registered the warmth at his side. It took a moment for his mind to catch up, for the events of the night before to resurface with startling clarity. Ethan was still beside him, his body relaxed, his breaths deep and even. Jake's hand was tangled with Ethan's, their fingers still intertwined as if neither of them had been willing to let go, even in sleep. Jake stared at their joined hands, a lump forming in his throat. It was so small a gesture, yet it felt monumental, a quiet confirmation of everything they hadn't said aloud. Jake shifted carefully, not wanting to wake Ethan just yet. The weight of the night settled over him, a complex mix of emotions swirling in his chest. Fear, longing, relief. He hadn't expected any of this, hadn't allowed himself to imagine that the connection he'd buried so deeply could be real, or that Ethan would feel the same pull. But here they were. Ethan stirred, his grip tightening slightly before his eyes fluttered open. For a moment he looked disoriented, his gaze darting around the room before landing on Jake. A slow, sleepy smile spread across his face, and Jake felt his chest tighten at the sight. "Morning," Ethan said softly, his voice rough with sleep. "Morning," Jake replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of what they'd shared and the uncertainty of what came next. Jake's heart raced, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he let his thumb brush lightly against Ethan's, the small motion grounding him. "We should probably talk," Ethan said after a moment, his tone cautious. Jake let out a soft laugh, though it sounded more like a sigh. "Yeah, I guess we should." Ethan sat up, his hand reluctantly slipping from Jake's as he raked a hand through his hair. He looked at Jake, his expression open but guarded, as though he were bracing for whatever Jake might say. Jake sat up too, his hands resting on his knees as he stared down at the rumpled sheets. "I don't even know where to start," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "This last night. I never thought—" "You don't have to explain," Ethan interrupted gently. "I know it's a lot. I know it's complicated. But I also know it's real." Jake looked at him then, his chest tightening at the quiet conviction in Ethan's gaze. "I'm scared," he said, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. "I don't know how to do this, how to be this." Ethan reached out, his hand resting lightly on Jake's knee. "You don't have to know everything right now," he said softly. "We'll figure it out together, one step at a time." Jake closed his eyes, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. He wanted to believe it could be that simple, that they could navigate this fragile, uncharted territory without it breaking them. But the doubts still lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. "What if we screw it up?" Jake asked, his voice barely audible. "What if this, whatever this is, ends up ruining everything?" Ethan's hand tightened slightly, a comforting pressure. "Then we deal with it," he said firmly. "But I don't think it will. I think we're stronger than that." Jake opened his eyes, his gaze meeting Ethan's. For a moment, the doubts receded, replaced by the quiet strength in Ethan's expression. It was enough to make Jake take a shaky breath to let himself believe, if only for a moment, that this could work. Ethan smiled faintly, his hand sliding from Jake's knee to his hand, their fingers intertwining once more. "Come on," he said, his voice lighter now. "Let's get some coffee. I think better when I'm caffeinated." Jake let out a soft laugh, the tension in his chest easing just a little. "Yeah, okay. Coffee sounds good." They moved together, their steps in sync as they headed downstairs. The house was quiet, the stillness of the early morning wrapping around them like a blanket. Jake felt the weight of Ethan's presence beside him, the quiet steadiness that grounded him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. In the kitchen, Ethan busied himself with the coffee maker, the soft clink of mugs and the hum of the machine filling the silence. Jake leaned against the counter, his gaze fixed on Ethan's back. There was something comforting in the normalcy of the moment, in the way they moved around each other as though this were just another morning. When the coffee was ready, Ethan handed Jake a mug, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The touch was fleeting, but it lingered in Jake's mind, a quiet reminder of everything that had changed between them. They sat at the small kitchen table, the sun creeping higher in the sky and casting golden light across the room. Jake stared into his coffee, his thoughts still tangled, but the tension in his chest was starting to ease. He glanced at Ethan, who was sipping his coffee with a thoughtful expression, and felt a flicker of something he hadn't let himself feel in years. Hope. "What now?" Jake asked, his voice quiet but steady. Ethan set his mug down, his gaze meeting Jake's. "Now, we take it one day at a time," he said simply. "No pressure, no expectations, just us." Jake nodded slowly, his chest tightening with a mix of fear and longing. He didn't have all the answers, didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he wasn't alone. They were in this together, and that was enough. For now, it was enough.